You've started to recognize the fruit fly cycle when you've been making your fly observations. Fruit flies are one of the many insects that go through complete metamorphosis. Metamorphosis is spelled METAMORPHOSIS. And complete metamorphosis means that they have 4 stages to their development. They have an embryo, which you might think of as an egg that's begun to develop into the organism. A larvae, which you might think of as a maggot or worm. Pupa, which you got to see sticking on the plastic mesh that you put in there. And then, of course, the adult that was flying around. Now, initially, I inoculated your cultures with 3 to 4 adult flies. And then I removed those flies after giving them time to mate and lay eggs. So you can see in the picture, following the female and male, you can see the embryo developing into the larvae, and there are different instars or stages of the larvae. And then you see that pre-pupa, which is a lighter color, and then you see that pupa, which is a brown color. Now, trophic pyramids is something we didn't have a chance to talk about in the ecology lecture. Trophic pyramids show how energy is lost as the food is passed through a food chain. So we've been talking about food chains and diagramming food chains and talking about how the arrow goes in a very particular direction. Larvae of fruit flies are specialized to feed on rotting vegetable matter that is undergoing fermentation due to yeast or bacterial contamination. So they are primary consumers. If you look at the trophic pyramid, you'll see where you see grasshoppers, that's where the fruit fly would go. And fruit flies do not eat grass, they eat the vegetable matter, the rotting vegetable matter or fruit, really. Either one will ferment. Now I want you to notice something about this trophic pyramid. You see how it has numbers associated with it, and you see how it becomes pointy at the top of the pyramid. Now there's a reason for that. So these trophic pyramids are also called biomass pyramids or pyramids of biomass. Or they're also called pyramids of numbers. And some people wonder why there's so many lower end organisms, like the grasshopper and the fruit fly, and yet so few top level organisms. And it has to do with the energy in this trophic pyramid. And so you'll see each level of this glorified food chain has an amount of kilocalories associated with it. So you'll see the grass has 1,000 kilocalories associated with it. So kilocalories is a measure of the amount of energy in that food. And then the next level up is 100, and then the next level up is 10, and then you finally get to the barn owl at the top and you see 1 kilocalorie. Now some of you who are very mathematical can see what's happening mathematically as you go from one level to the other. So push pause for a second, look at it, see if you can figure out how it's changing from level to level. So you'll notice that every time that energy is passed or eaten, it's losing 90% of its energy. So this loss of 90% of the energy every time it passes a level is called the 10% rule, because only 10% of the energy is going to be passed and the rest is lost as heat. So every one of these levels, I want you to draw an arrow going off of it. So from the grass, draw an arrow going off of it and put heat. And I want you to draw an arrow off of the grasshoppers and put heat. And then draw an arrow off of these shrews. You can see their very pointed nose and put heat. And then you finally get to the top level tertiary consumer in this food chain and you see the barn owl and it gets the remainder of the energy. So the reason why you have tons on the bottom and not at the top is because there's less energy as it's passed and less energy to support organisms. Now this is another part of the ecology lecture that we did not get to. It's called the niche. And so we're going to talk about the fruit fly niche. And this whole lecture is information you can put in the background information of your next paper in the introduction. So an ecological niche is an organism's role in its community or habitat. There are actually different types of niches that we're not going to get into, so just suffice it to say that it's its role in the community or habitat. The niche includes predators, food source, time of day it is most active, where it breeds. I mean, there's tons of stuff that make up the niche. And so you're probably wondering some of the predators that eat fruit flies. So push pause for a minute, think about, gee, what would eat those fruit flies? And then I'll tell you. So a lot of things eat fruit flies. Amphibians eat them, reptiles eat them, carnivorous plants that we have in this area eat them, spiders, birds. So there's some birds that like flycatchers that will just eat insects, and you'll see them flying around eating insects. So they may be pesty to you, and you might want to think about how you want to eradicate all the fruit flies, but if you did that, it would affect the organisms that feed on them. So organisms will avoid competition whenever possible. So they usually evolve different niches so that they're not competing with other species. And this type of competition is called interspecies competition. So inter and then species competition. Organisms, when they're competing amongst their own species, that's called intraspecies competition. And so you might want to write this off to the side. Interspecies is between species, intraspecies is within your own species. And so if you're competing within your own species, you're just going to migrate, you're just going to move out until you find your own food source. But interspecies, that's not always possible because there are other organisms that share the ecosystem or the habitat with you that are in other species in your community. So the fruit fly is a primary consumer. We said that before. It relies on a source of sugar. Usually fruit or vegetables also have sugars in them. They also help spread yeast and bacteria. So they do some pollinating, so to speak, except for instead of spreading pollen, they are spreading bacteria and yeast. And humans recreate this niche with rotting fruit in their kitchens and recycling bins that have excess, soda in them, and they're hanging around for weeks, and it's a perfect environment for fruit flies to breed in. And so on the right, you can see a picture of a fruit fly. It looks like on an orange, and they can lay their eggs pretty quickly if that fruit is left out on the counter. So the best thing to do is just put it in your fridge. Now this next idea of limiting factors has to do with what puts populations in checks and stops them from totally exponentially growing forever. And so populations are kept in check by things called limiting factors. And hopefully pause for a second and think about whether you remember that definition of a population. And so remember, a population is a very specific species in a very particular area, and they can interbreed with each other. So if there's a mountain separating a population, or there's another population on the other side of the United States, you can't interbreed with each other, so you are not in the same population. So these limiting factors can be density independent or density dependent. Density dependent is a factor that limits a population and depends on the density. So like disease. So the more crowded you get, the more disease there's going to be. That's going to limit your population. A population limiting factor whose intensity is unrelated to population density is a density independent factor. So that would be like storms, droughts, things like that are going to keep a population in check that has nothing to do with the density of the population. So you can see these two graphs. The one on the left, it's showing time and then the population size. And you can see the population is growing exponentially or unrestricted. And you can see in the right graph, you can see that restriction starts to come into play, and the population is decreased. And this is called your classic S curve. Can you see how it kind of is shaped like an S? And you see a dotted line, and it says carrying capacity of the environment. So the carrying capacity of the environment is the maximum number of organisms that can live in that environment without destroying the environment. And so it's a really good thing. You want the carrying capacity to remain in check. You don't want too many organisms in a particular area. And so I want you to stop for a second and think about these fly cultures that you are growing. And think about what's keeping that population in check. What's keeping it from just growing exponentially forever. And I want you to actually write down some ideas that you have right above this graph right here. Ideas for what you think is keeping your population in check. And then I want you to decide whether that thing you came up with is a density dependent or density independent factor. And I want you to write that down right next to your answer. So go ahead and push pause and write that down, and you will be graded on the fact that you wrote this down. So fruit fly food web and biodiversity. So this idea of biodiversity is so important in an ecosystem. Some people call it richness. It's a thing we really have a hard time thinking of as humans, as we hate some of these organisms that are around, that are pests. They're flying in our food. They're digging holes in the ground around our house. That if you eradicated those organisms, it's actually going to affect you in the long run, because it's going to affect things that you care about. And so it's that understanding that there's a richness in a food web and everything is depending on everything else. And so you want all those organisms around to help support each other and keep a healthy ecosystem. So biodiversity is an indicator of the health of an ecosystem, and it's a really good thing to have in an ecosystem. When you actually start looking at your flies, you're going to see some really cool mutations. So I bought some particular mutations I thought might interest you. And so one of the reasons why fruit flies are used in genetics is because they have multiple mutations. They are also easy to grow, and their generation time is really short. So, roughly 2 weeks, but it can shorten up depending on the temperature and the environment. So you're about to see that. So at the top, you see eye-shaped phenotypes. Phenotypes just means characteristics. And you see the wild type eye shape. And I want you to write down at the top of this slide what wild type means, because you're going to see that word a lot in this class as we're talking about fruit flies. So wild type means that the average fruit fly, the normal fruit fly, that you would see in the environment. And so the normal fruit fly has a wild type eye that looks like that. And as a lot of you noticed when you were taking observations, it's a red color. And so you are going to look at a mutation called sepia mutation. And I'm going to let you figure out what that means, but it has to do with the eye color. And so when you're observing, hopefully you will figure it out. And then there are all these different bristle phenotypes. We're not going to deal with any of those, but we're going to deal with the next type of mutation down, which is a wing mutation. And so if you look the second row down, the second from the left, you will see that fly has no wings. And that mutation is called apterous mutation, APTEROUS. And so I want you to circle that fly, second row down, second from the left. I want you to circle that fly with no wings, and I want you to write apterous. And some of you are going to remember writing that on your label when you were creating your fly cultures. Last slide. You have to be able to tell the difference between a male and female fruit fly. And Don't look for a penis. You are not going to see it. So male fruit flies keep um, their penis-like structure inside them. Um, and then they put it into the female and they fertilize internally, and then she lays her eggs. So the male and female fruit flies look different. You're going to need to be able to recognize these differences. So most of the differences can be seen on the fly's abdomen. So when you learned about insects in 6th grade, you learned they have 3 body parts: head, thorax, and abdomen. So abdomen is the bottom part. And so I want you to look at these, and this is another thing you should have writing in your packet when you come into class tomorrow. I want you to describe 3 differences that you see between the female, that's the one on the left, and the male, that's the one on the right, and you see them in their abdominal areas. And that is it. So hopefully, to kind of recap, this lecture was to teach you about fruit flies, because you're going to be putting this information into your introduction. We learned some ecology terms that you're going to be reading about in chapter 19. So this is kind of gives a place to learn about those terms like biodiversity, limiting factors, and trophic pyramids. Also, you will be reading about it in that chapter. So really understanding the role of the fruit fly. That role is called the niche. And starting to think about these things that you're growing in your cultures. That is it. Come into class tomorrow with this packet all filled out, and you will be graded on it. Thanks for listening. Bye.